Picture the Roman Forum on a warm spring afternoon in the year 67 AD. Marble columns gleam in the sun, merchants shout over one another in the crowded stalls, and the heavy scent of incense mixes with the metallic tang of armor. The heart of the empire thrums with life. Senators stride past in white togas edged with purple priests, move between temples offering sacrifices to Jupiter, and soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, always watchful, keep the restless crowd at bay. Then a hush falls. A ripple of whispers moves like a breeze through the gathered citizens. The emperor approaches. Nero, ruler of 60 million souls, strides through the forum, not in armor, but in the silks of a man who fancies himself an artist. His hair glints gold in the light, his expression both haughty and strangely childlike, as if forever caught between performance and paranoia. But what silences the crowd is not Nero himself. It is the figure at his side, a young woman draped in jewels and silks, finer than anything most Romans will ever see, walks beside him. She is beautiful with delicate features that recall the face of a goddess sculpted in ivory. To the casual eye, she is his new wife, his consort, the Empress of Rome. But everyone knows the terrible truth. She is not a woman at all. The figure walking with Nero is Sporus, a boy scarcely past adolescence, forced into this role by an emperor's grief, obsession, and cruelty. The spectacle is not just unsettling, it is horrifying. To Romans, gender roles are rigid, sacred even, and marriage is a cornerstone of family honor and political order. To parade a boy surgically altered and renamed as the reborn image of a dead wife, it is an act that pushes beyond scandal into the realm of sacrilege. Yet no one dares speak against it aloud. They whisper instead, their eyes lower their voices cautious, for they know that in this empire, truth is whatever the emperor declares it to be, and those who resist that fiction often vanish. It is here in this moment that Sporus' story truly begins, not as an individual with a name and a history, but as a symbol and object molded to fill the void left by a woman who once held Nero's heart. His tragedy is not only one of violence and forced transformation, but of erasure. He is turned into a living ghost, a mirror for another's memory. But to understand how the Roman Empire arrived at such a grotesque spectacle, we must return to the man at the center of it all. Nero did not begin his reign as a monster. In fact, when he first took the throne at 16, many believed a golden age was dawning. How then did promise twist into cruelty? How did love become obsession? Grief mutate into madness, and a teenage boy become a living doll in the emperor's grotesque theater of power. This is not merely a tale of Roman excess. It is the story of how absolute authority distorts reality itself. It is about the human cost of unchecked power, the ways it can strip away identity, agency, and dignity until a person becomes a puppet in someone else's performance. The name Sporus may not echo as loudly as Caesar or Augustus, but his story, once uncovered, clings to the imagination like a shadow. It is the story of survival under impossible conditions and of a final act of defiance that still resonates across 2,000 years. We begin, as all tragedies do, with hope. When Nero first ascended the throne in 54 AD, he was barely 16 years old, a boy emperor in a world that revered age, lineage, and tradition. Rome had seen emperors rise and fall, but this one felt different. He was young, handsome, and at least in the beginning, eager to please. Many Romans looked at him and imagined a new Augustus, a leader who might blend youthful vigor with the wisdom of his advisors. After years of political intrigue and assassination, plots under Claudius and Caligula, the empire seemed ready for a calmer hand. In his early reign, Nero surprised everyone with policies that seemed generous, even enlightened. Taxes were lowered, a relief to the burdened provinces. Games and public spectacles multiplied, keeping the people entertained and, more importantly, content. He made efforts to appear close to the common citizen, performing in theaters and sponsoring events that gave the impression of a ruler in tune with his subjects. It was a performance, but an effective one. The people adored him. The Senate, however, regarded him with cautious optimism. They saw in him a malleable youth, one guided by powerful figures, such as his mother Agrippina the Younger and the philosopher Seneca. Agrippina was perhaps the most ambitious woman in Rome, and her son's throne was the pinnacle of her lifelong schemes. Seneca, by contrast, was a Stoic thinker who believed in temperance and reason, striving to mold Nero into a philosopher king. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that this unlikely arrangement, maternal ambition balanced by philosophical restraint, might lead Rome into stability. But Rome was never a place for balance. Power here was not a tool to be wielded with moderation. It was a tidal force that consumed those who touched it. For Nero, the throne was not only a responsibility, it was a stage. He was not content to rule quietly. He wanted to be adored, admired, worshipped not only as emperor, but as artist, poet, musician, even God. His reign, even in its earliest days, was marked by this need for performance. Behind the curtain of public benevolence, cracks began to show. The very youth that made Nero appealing also made him volatile. He had grown up in the shadow of plots, whispers, and betrayals, surrounded by people who valued him not as a boy, but as a means to power. From the start, paranoia seeped into his character. When you are emperor, every ally is a potential rival, every friend a possible assassin. By his late teens, Nero had already ordered deaths within his own family. First, his stepbrother Britannicus, poisoned at a banquet. Then the gradual sidelining and eventual killing of his mother Agrippina. These acts sent a clear message: the emperor may be young, but he was not weak. By the mid-60s AD, the hopeful boy who had once promised Rome a golden age had transformed. He was still adored by the masses, but the Senate grew fearful of his unpredictability. He lavished wealth on himself and his circle, draining the treasury. He staged elaborate performances, forcing Rome's elite to watch and applaud. What began as harmless indulgence slipped into something darker: cruelty disguised as spectacle. Nero had discovered that no one in the empire could contradict him. He could sing race or dictate policy without challenge. The empire bent itself around his desires, and yet even this indulgence might not have spiraled into nightmare if not for what happened in Nero's personal life. Absolute power does not only warp governance, it corrodes love. What Nero wanted most was not merely control of Rome, but possession of beauty itself, embodied in one woman who would capture his heart and ultimately unravel his sanity. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she would become both his muse and his downfall. It was through her that the boy emperor would reveal how fragile he truly was, and how dangerous a man can become when grief collides with unchecked authority. When Nero first encountered Poppaea, Sabina, the course of his life, and indeed the fate of the empire, shifted irreversibly. Poppaea was unlike the women of his household, unlike the pliant courtiers who orbited the imperial court. She was dazzlingly beautiful, described by ancient writers as possessing a complexion so luminous it seemed touched by the gods. But beauty was only the beginning. Poppaea was intelligent, cunning, and ambitious, a woman who understood that in Rome, survival and influence were not secured by charm alone, but by strategy. At the time, Nero was married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor Claudius. Their union had been politically arranged to solidify Nero's legitimacy as ruler. Octavia was dutiful, quiet, and by all accounts, kind-hearted. But she inspired little passion in Nero. Their marriage was symbolic, not romantic. In her presence, he felt constrained, tethered to tradition. Poppaea, by contrast, embodied everything Octavia was not. Where Octavia faded into the background of the imperial court, Poppaea radiated presence. She was vivacious, commanding, unafraid to dominate a room. From the moment Nero met her, he was transfixed. Their affair began like many in Rome's upper classes, scandalous, but not unusual. Adultery was woven into the tapestry of aristocratic life, and emperors had always enjoyed privileges denied to others. But what set this affair apart was the depth of Nero's obsession. Poppaea did not remain a dalliance. She became an all-consuming passion. Ancient sources hint at the magnetism she held over him. Suetonius suggests Nero was willing to defy convention tradition, even his closest advisors, to be with her. Tacitus describes her as a master manipulator who wielded her beauty as both shield and weapon. Whether she genuinely loved Nero or simply recognized the opportunity to elevate herself is uncertain. What is clear is that she played her role with precision, feeding his vanity, encouraging his artistic ambitions, and positioning herself as indispensable. Rome was a city that thrived on spectacle, gossip, and scandal, and the romance between the emperor and Poppaea became its most intoxicating drama. To the Roman people, it was more than adultery. It was betrayal. Octavia, the beloved daughter of Claudius, represented continuity with a dynasty that had ruled for decades. To abandon her was to insult not only a woman, but a lineage. Nero knew this, and still he chose Poppaea. The affair rippled outward like a stone dropped into a still pond, unsettling the Senate, angering traditionalists, and fueling whispers of imperial recklessness. Poppaea understood the risks, but also the rewards. She had been married before and knew how to navigate the precarious web of Roman power. Her ambition matched Nero's obsession, and she began to weave herself into the machinery of rule. She spoke openly on matters of politics, criticized Octavia's place as empress, and urged Nero to rid himself of his first wife. She was not content to remain a mistress. She demanded legitimacy. In this, she succeeded brilliantly. Nero divorced Octavia, a shocking act in itself, and soon after orchestrated her downfall. Octavia was accused of adultery, a charge few believed, but none dared challenge, and eventually forced into exile. Her death soon followed, likely ordered by Nero himself. For Poppaea, the path to power was now clear. Their marriage was nothing short of imperial theater. Rome had seen extravagant weddings before, but Nero surpassed them all. The celebration was a dazzling display of wealth and devotion, with banquets that stretched late into the night, jewels imported from India, silks that shimmered from China, perfumes carried on caravans from Arabia. Every detail proclaimed not only Nero's devotion, but also his determination to remake reality around his desires. Poppaea had achieved what few women in Roman history dared dream. She had captured the heart of an emperor so completely that he reshaped the world to keep her. Yet this triumph was precarious, for Nero's love was not gentle. It was the kind of passion that consumed and destroyed. The line between devotion and possession blurred quickly, and Poppaea, though ambitious, could not have foreseen how dangerous her husband's obsession would become. For now she was Empress Radiant at the emperor's side. But Rome was watching. Senators murmured about her influence, Ordinary citizens whispered about Octavia's tragic fate, and even Nero's closest advisors saw with unease how tightly the emperor had bound himself to this woman. Love had made him vulnerable, and vulnerability in an emperor could transform into terror. It was a union destined to ignite both his deepest devotion and his darkest rage. With Poppaea Sabina now firmly enthroned as his wife, Nero's passion began to spiral into obsession. To him, she was not merely a partner, but the very axis around which his world revolved. He could not simply love her. He had to own her, to mold her, to ensure that no one else could ever touch or diminish what he believed was his alone. The emperor lavished her with gifts that staggered the imagination. Pearls of staggering size from the Red Sea delicate silks, carried overland across Asia. Gold-threaded garments from the far reaches of the empire. Every corner of Rome's vast dominions seemed summoned to supply tokens of his devotion. Poppaea's chambers glittered with treasures, amphorae filled with exotic perfumes from Arabia, couches draped in fabrics softer than clouds, ornaments carved by artisans whose names are now lost, but whose works glowed in torchlight as if alive. It was said that a single banquet in her honor could bankrupt provinces. Such was the scale of Nero's extravagance. But these gifts were not born of generosity. They were chains disguised as treasures. The more he gave her, the more he claimed her, as though each jewel and bauble fastened her more tightly to him. To Nero, love was not shared, it was consumed. The emperor's paranoia, already a feature of his character, now focused on her with terrifying intensity. Poppaea was surrounded by guards at all times, ostensibly for protection, but in truth to monitor every glance, every word spoken in her presence. At public events, Nero's temper flared at the slightest hint of another man's attention lingering on her. A smile, a whispered compliment, even a glance could trigger jealous suspicion. He began to isolate her from family and friends, replacing trusted confidants with courtiers loyal only to him. Those who had once surrounded her were dismissed, exiled, or worse. In their place came attendants whose only function was to preserve the fiction of Nero's perfect devotion. In this way, Poppaea's world shrank until her life was lived within the walls of the palace, gilded and perfumed, yet claustrophobic and dangerous. Nero's obsession extended into the realm of art. He commissioned endless portrait sculptures and mosaics of her likeness, not only for public spaces, but for his private chambers. He wanted her image everywhere, gazing down from walls, smiling from ivory carvings immortalized in silver and gold. He even employed artists to sculpt her in the guise of goddesses Venus-Juno Ceres, so that the boundaries between mortal woman and divine ideal blurred. To Nero, she was not simply his wife. She was beauty itself, an object to be preserved, worshipped, and most disturbingly possessed. Historians describe him spending hours silently watching her as she moved about her daily life, transfixed as though by a stage performance. To the emperor, who fancied himself an artist, Poppaea was his greatest creation, the living embodiment of his aesthetic and his desire. Yet beneath the glittering devotion, there was a darker truth. Nero did not love her as a partner. He adored her as one might adore a statue, an object incapable of contradiction or resistance. For her part, Poppaea was no passive figure in this drama. She was astute enough to recognize the perilous power she wielded. She used her influence to promote her family and allies, weaving a network of supporters within the court. She cultivated her role as empress, carefully presenting herself as both radiant consort and political actor. Yet even she could not escape the danger of Nero's possessiveness. Rome itself looked on with fascination and unease. Ordinary citizens whispered of the emperor's extravagance, Senators muttered about his indulgences, but no one dared speak openly of the way Nero's love for Poppaea seemed to slip into madness. Love had become theater devotion, had become surveillance, and beauty had become a prison. What Poppaea may not have realized, what perhaps even Nero did not fully grasp, was how fragile this arrangement truly was. For obsession, no matter how gilded, can curdle in an instant. A single word, a single moment of defiance could shatter the illusion. And in an empire where one man's emotions could alter the fate of millions, that fragility was more dangerous than any dagger. The stage was set for tragedy. All it required was one fateful quarrel, and the emperor's passion would transform into lethal rage. The imperial palace in 65 AD was a theater of contradictions, filled with music and laughter at banquets, yet haunted by fear behind closed doors. Nero's devotion to Poppaea had reached a fever pitch, but like a fire fed too fiercely, it consumed rather than warmed. Those closest to the imperial couple knew that their relationship teetered on a knife's edge. Every day carried the possibility of ecstasy or catastrophe. The quarrel that ended in tragedy has been preserved in fragments pieced together from the works of historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. Each offers a slightly different version, but all agree on one outcome: the death of Poppaea Sabina, pregnant with Nero's child. Some say the argument began when Nero returned late from chariot races, intoxicated by the roar of the crowd and indifferent to his wife's reproaches. Others claim it was her sharp criticism of his artistic pursuits, mocking the emperor's endless desire to be seen as a musician and actor. Tacitus records that she accused him of caring more for performance than for the duties of rule or the responsibilities of fatherhood. Whatever the precise cause, it is clear that Poppaea had dared to speak truth to him, to pierce the delicate bubble of adoration in which he lived. She was heavily pregnant at the time her second child by Nero, and perhaps his best hope for an heir. Yet the weight of her condition did not protect her. In the heat of rage, Nero lashed out. Some sources say it was a single brutal kick to her abdomen. Others describe repeated blows delivered in a frenzy of violence. What is certain is that her body collapsed under the assault. She fell to the marble floor. Bleeding and gasping, her unborn child lost in the attack. Imagine the scene: the most powerful man in the world, whose word could command legions and topple kingdoms, staring in horror at the broken body of the woman he had once worshipped as divine. Nero, accustomed to commanding life and death, now confronted a reality even he could not control. The empress lay dying, and no amount of power could reverse the damage he himself had inflicted. Desperation overtook him. He summoned physicians, offering them fortunes if they could save her, and threatening unspeakable tortures if they failed. Yet Roman medicine, primitive and brutal, could do little in the face of internal injury. Some of the greatest healers in the empire stood helpless as Poppaea slipped away. Within hours, both she and the unborn child were gone. The accounts of what followed are almost pathetic in their detail. Nero is said to have thrown himself upon her body alternately, begging forgiveness and commanding her to live as though his imperial voice could order death to retreat. He wailed, he raged, he pleaded, but nothing pierced the silence of her lifeless form. The death of Poppaea was not just the loss of a wife, it was the collapse of Nero's carefully constructed world. He had built his life, his image, his sense of self around her beauty and presence. Now, by his own uncontrolled violence, he had destroyed the object of his obsession. For a man who had blurred the boundaries between love and possession, between art and reality, the shock was devastating. The political consequences were equally profound. Poppeia's death robbed Rome of a future empress and denied Nero the heir he desperately needed. The Senate and people of Rome, already uneasy with his extravagance, now whispered of madness and instability. To them, this was not simply a domestic tragedy, it was a dangerous omen for the empire itself. In Roman culture, heirs were more than children. They were the lifeline of dynasties. Without one, Nero's reign hung precariously on his ability to control a restless nobility and an increasingly cynical Senate. Poppeia's unborn child might have secured his dynasty. Her death deepened the uncertainty that surrounded him. Yet what is most haunting about this moment is not the political fallout, but the human one. For all his cruelty and paranoia, Nero's grief was real. It twisted him further, unmooring him from reality. He could not bear the guilt of what he had done, nor could he accept the permanence of death. His mourning would soon transform into ritual delusion and grotesque attempts to undo the irreversible. The emperor had slain the one he loved most, and in the ashes of that act, Rome would witness not a man atoning, but a man descending into madness. The death of Poppaea Sabina marked a rupture in Nero's mind that no crown, no army, no performance could mend. The emperor, who had once delighted the people with music and spectacle, now found himself adrift in a storm of grief, guilt, and denial. Yet Nero did not mourn like an ordinary man. Where others wept and buried, he exalted and deified. His sorrow became theater, and the empire itself was forced to play its part. Poppeia's body was not consigned to the flames as Roman custom demanded. Cremation, the act that symbolized release into the afterlife, was too final for Nero. Instead, he ordered her embalmed and entombed in a mausoleum that rivaled those of Rome's greatest rulers. Her funeral was a pageant of extravagance, golden biers, perfumes heavy in the air, musicians lamenting through the night. Rome had seen imperial funerals before, but none so excessive, so drenched in personal obsession. It was less a farewell than an attempt to defy mortality itself. Nero's grief quickly took on religious dimensions. He declared Poppaea divine, establishing shrines in her honor, commanding priests to tend to her cult. Her image appeared not just in the palace, but in temples, as though she were a goddess reborn. The empress, who in life had been elevated above her peers, was in death placed among the immortals, not because the Senate had decreed it, but because the emperor demanded it. Rome's rituals bent around his sorrow as laws and traditions dissolved under the weight of his obsession. In the palace, the spectacle grew stranger still. Nero was said to spend hours speaking to her corpse, as if she might answer. Servants whispered that he dined with her embalmed body, that he stroked her hair, and murmured as though she still lived. Whether these stories are exaggerations or truth is impossible to know, but they reveal how his grief appeared to others, not dignified mourning, but madness laid bare. The court became a stage of enforced illusion. Courtiers were expected to act as though Poppaea were still present, to leave her seat empty at banquets, to refer to her in the present tense. To deviate from the performance was dangerous. Senators and attendants alike learned to nod solemnly when Nero spoke of her, as if she were alive to play along with the fiction that love and power had conquered death. In this charade, truth itself bent to the emperor's will. This was not entirely unprecedented in Roman culture. The deification of the dead was a tradition, and emperors had long blurred the line between human and divine. Yet there was something grotesquely personal in Nero's rituals. Augustus had been worshipped as a god for the stability he brought to the empire, Julius Caesar for his conquests. Poppaea, by contrast, was exalted because Nero could not accept her absence. What Rome witnessed was not piety, but denial elevated to state policy. Grief, when paired with absolute authority, becomes dangerous. Nero's mourning was not a private wound. It reshaped the empire's ceremonies, distorted its truths, and demanded that millions participate in a fantasy born from one man's broken heart. The more he clung to the memory of Poppaea, the further he drifted from reality. And it was in this state of unmoored obsession that Nero first turned his gaze upon Sporus, a boy of delicate beauty, a freedman raised within the palace. Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead empress. In his features, Nero saw not simply a young man, but an opportunity, a chance to undo what had been lost, to resurrect the woman he had destroyed. The transformation of grief into obsession, and of obsession into cruelty, was about to take a new and terrible form. In the shadow of Poppaea's death, Nero's court was a place of tension and whispered fear. Every senator, every servant, every guest at the palace knew they were living inside the emperor's grief, forced to perform in his private theater of denial. Into this charged atmosphere stepped a boy whose fate would become one of the most haunting tragedies in Roman history. Sporus. Sporus was about 14 or 15 at the time, a young freedman raised within the imperial household. He had been born into slavery, but like many boys in service to the palace, he was manumitted at an early age, trained for administrative duties, and educated in literacy, etiquette, and loyalty. Freedmen in Nero's court often occupied positions of privilege, even influence. They lived closer to power than most citizens ever could, but this privilege was precarious, for it was rooted entirely in the emperor's favor. To rise meant owing everything to one man and being utterly defenseless when his whims shifted. What set Sporus apart was not his wit or education, but his face. Ancient writers are unanimous in their observation. Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea. The curve of his cheekbones, the shape of his eyes, the softness of his features. Something in his appearance struck Nero like a thunderbolt. In a world where Romans believed that outward beauty reflected inner essence, this resemblance carried almost mystical weight. To Nero, it seemed as if the gods themselves had returned his lost love to him, reincarnated in another form. Imagine the moment Nero, broken by grief, glances across the marble halls and sees a boy whose face echoes the woman he has destroyed. To an ordinary man, it might have been a passing resemblance, a painful reminder. But to an emperor who had already convinced himself that he could bend reality to his will, it was something more. It was an opportunity to rewrite fate. There was, of course, one insurmountable obstacle. Sporus was male. But for Nero, a man who believed himself not merely ruler, but artist, not merely emperor, but divine gender, was a trivial detail. He had already blurred the lines between truth and illusion, between life and death. Why should the boundary between male and female be any different? And so the decision was made, a decision that would mark Sporus forever. Nero would transform him into Poppaea, not in spirit, not in memory, but in flesh. Sporus would become the new empress of Rome, sculpted by the emperor's will into a living reflection of the woman he could not let go. In that moment, Sporus ceased to exist as himself. Whatever dreams he might have carried, whatever identity he might have hoped to forge, were obliterated under the weight of Nero's obsession. He became not a person, but a vessel, a canvas upon which the emperor would paint the image of his lost love. The court must have watched in horrified fascination as this plan unfolded. Some may have pitied the boy, others may have smirked at the grotesque absurdity of it, but none dared intervene. To question Nero's grief was to risk death. To resist his fantasy was to be destroyed. And so silence reigned, while Sporus was drawn inexorably into a nightmare. The boy who looked like Poppaea would soon become her replacement, not by choice, but by command. And in the cold chambers of the palace, Roman physicians prepared their instruments, ready to carry out one of the most cruel and calculated acts of mutilation in recorded history. What followed was not an affair nor a romance, nor even a scandal. It was an act of deliberate erasure, an emperor reshaping a boy into the image of a dead woman. When Nero looked upon Sporus, he did not see a living, breathing human being. He saw clay to be molded a canvas upon which grief could be painted into life again. And so he commanded the unthinkable. Physicians were summoned to the palace, the most skilled men Rome could offer. Their task was not to heal, but to mutilate. Nero ordered that Sporus undergo a surgical castration, stripping him of the ability to grow into manhood. This was no simple procedure. Roman medicine, though advanced for its time, was crude and brutal by modern standards. They possessed scalpels, cauterizing irons, and rudimentary herbs for dulling pain, but they lacked true anesthesia. Survival itself was uncertain. Infection could kill as surely as the knife. The boy would have been restrained, held down by guards, as the physicians went about their grim work. The chamber must have filled with his screams echoing against marble walls, while Nero's court carried on as if nothing were amiss. For Sporus, the moment marked not only the physical destruction of his body, but the obliteration of his identity. He would never father children. He would never be seen as fully male again. His life, once precarious, but his own, was now irrevocably rewritten. Yet surgery was only the beginning. Once his body was altered, the process of transformation into Sabina, the name Nero gave him after Poppaea, began in earnest. Tutors were assigned to reshape his voice, his movements, his very manner of being. He was taught to walk with measured grace, to keep his eyes lowered at the proper angle, to hold his hands delicately, instead of with masculine strength. Every gesture was rehearsed until it conformed to the ideal of Roman femininity. Cosmetics became daily ritual. Kohl was applied to enlarge his eyes rouge, to bring a false flush to his cheeks powders, to soften the angles of his jaw. Court hairdressers labored for hours to curl and arrange his hair in the elaborate fashions of noblewomen, weaving in golden pins and jeweled ornaments once worn by Poppaea herself. Seamstresses crafted gowns that concealed his masculine frame, layering fabric to create the illusion of softness, while jewelers fitted him with necklaces and rings that had once adorned the empress he was meant to replace. But perhaps most harrowing were the psychological lessons. Sporus was not only dressed as a woman, he was taught to inhabit one. Tutors drilled him in speech patterns, training him to pitch his voice higher, to adopt the cadences of feminine discourse. He was instructed in how to sit at banquets, how to pour wine with grace, how to smile without showing too much of his teeth. These were not merely lessons in etiquette. They were exercises in the systematic erasure of self. Each correction, each forced repetition, was a reminder that his old identity was gone. Imagine the torment of those days. Every mirror Sporus looked into reflected not his own face, but the ghost of Poppaea Sabina staring back. Every jewel, every robe, every gesture rehearsed was another shackle binding him to a role he never chose. Even his name was stripped away, replaced with hers. He was no longer Sporus, son of no one freedman of the palace. He was Sabina, Empress of Rome, resurrected in grotesque imitation. The court, seasoned in the art of pretense, played along. At dinners and festivals, they addressed him by his new name, bowed as though before an empress, and praised his beauty in tones laced with horror and pity. No one dared speak of the boy beneath the silks, for to acknowledge the truth was to risk the emperor's wrath. And through it all, Nero watched with satisfaction. In his eyes, he had undone the irreversible. He had conquered death, remade the past, and summoned Poppaea back into his life. He believed the performance so completely that he no longer seemed to distinguish between memory and reality. For Sporus, however, every day was a performance on the edge of annihilation. A misstep, a slip of the voice, a moment of defiance could mean death. And yet he endured, adapting, surviving, hollowed out, but still breathing. The final act of this transformation would come not in the private chambers of the palace, but before the eyes of the empire itself. Nero intended to prove to Rome and to himself that his beloved had returned. And so he prepared for a wedding. The spring of 67 AD brought with it one of the strangest ceremonies Rome had ever witnessed. The imperial palace glittered with preparations for what was to be a wedding. Unlike any other Nero emperor of the Roman world would marry Sporus, the boy he had reshaped into the image of his dead wife. The court had seen spectacles before, but this was different. This was not merely excess. It was a declaration of the emperor's will to bend reality itself. The palace halls were drenched in flowers imported from distant provinces, their fragrance heavy in the air. Thousands of oil lamps illuminated marble colonnades, casting a golden glow upon walls hung with silks from the east. Musicians rehearsed ancient wedding songs, their notes trembling in the air like whispers of disbelief. Senators, generals, and foreign dignitaries filed in, their expressions carefully schooled. They knew what they were about to witness defied nature and tradition. But to show hesitation was dangerous. To participate with enthusiasm was survival. Sporus, now renamed Sabina, after Poppaea was arrayed in bridal finery. Seamstresses had spent months crafting garments to disguise the lines of his body, draping him in layers of silk and gold-threaded fabric that shimmered like firelight. Jewels that had once adorned Poppaea herself now rested on his neck and wrists, their weight as much a burden as a display of splendor. His hair was styled in elaborate curls, pinned with ornaments and dusted with powders to soften every trace of masculinity. He did not look like himself. He looked like the shadow of a ghost called back to life. The ceremony unfolded with the solemnity of tradition. Nero and Sporus joined hands, exchanged vows, and shared the sacred bread. Priests presided as if nothing were amiss, reciting the same formulas spoken at countless Roman weddings. Legal documents were signed, binding them as husband and wife under imperial law. To the casual observer, it was indistinguishable from the marriage of any empress. But beneath the spectacle lay a current of unease so thick it seemed to choke the air. Everyone knew they were witnessing something grotesque, something born of grief warped into obsession. And yet the performance continued. Courtiers offered congratulations, showered the couple with gifts, and raised their goblets in forced celebration. They laughed and smiled with the ease of actors, concealing horror behind masks of loyalty. In their hearts, they knew they were complicit in a fiction, but to survive, they had to play along. From that day forward, Sporus lived not as himself, but as Rome's empress. He was granted a household staff attendance and the wealth of the imperial treasury. He traveled in a litter like noblewomen, surrounded by guards. At banquets, he sat beside Nero, receiving the same honors as any imperial consort. In public, he was addressed as Sabina, treated with the deference owed to an empress. To the empire, Nero had married his dead wife, reborn, and no one dared speak otherwise. But beneath the glittering surface, the psychological torment deepened. Each day was an act of survival, a performance where the smallest slip could prove fatal. Sporus was expected not only to look like Poppaea, but to inhabit her memories. When Nero reminisced about moments from his past marriage, Sporus had to respond as if he remembered them too. When Nero spoke to him by Poppaea's name, Sporus answered without hesitation. His very existence became a lie sustained by fear. Imagine the suffocating weight of such a role. Every mirror reflected a stranger's face. Every gesture was rehearsed. Every word was calculated. His identity once fragile, but his own was now buried beneath silks and jewels that were in truth shackles. To live was to play Nero's fantasy day after day without end, and yet Sporus adapted. Ancient writers remark on his uncanny ability to anticipate Nero's moods, to play the roles so convincingly that he seemed almost supernatural in his skill. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps sheer will to survive. But behind the mask, he grew increasingly withdrawn, melancholic, hollowed by the life forced upon him. The empire too played along. To outsiders, ambassadors from Greece, traders from Egypt, it seemed they were seeing the Empress of Rome beautiful and radiant. Few could have known the truth. Those who did could only marvel at the sheer audacity of it, the emperor of the world demanding that his fantasy become reality, and an entire nation bowing to that fantasy as law. For more than 2 years, Sporus lived as Nero's wife, his every day a grotesque performance. But Rome was never a stage that allowed illusions to endure forever. By 68 AD, rebellion spread across the provinces, generals rose against Nero, and the Senate prepared to strip him of power. The emperor who had dared to resurrect the dead now found his own life unraveling, and when Nero fell, Sporus, his unwilling empress, would be left exposed, more vulnerable than ever before. By the summer of 68 AD, the empire that Nero believed he had bent to his will was crumbling around him. Provincial governors revolted their legions, refusing loyalty to a ruler who squandered the treasury on theaters and festivals while Rome's frontiers burned. The Senate, once pliant and fearful, declared him a public enemy. Even the Praetorian Guard guardians of the emperor's life abandoned him when they sensed the tide turning. The stage Nero had built for himself, grand, dazzling, grotesque, was collapsing, and he stood at its center, a failed actor in his own tragedy. Sporus remained at his side until the end. When Nero fled Rome terrified of capture and humiliation, he took only a small band of loyalists with him. Among them was the boy empress, the living shadow of Poppaea. One can almost picture it, the most powerful man in the world, reduced to a frightened fugitive clutching not weapons or treasures, but a young man dressed as his dead wife, as though carrying his fantasy into exile could shield him from reality. They hid in a villa outside the city while news arrived of encroaching enemies. Nero veered between delusion and despair, devising grand escape plans one moment and rehearsing tragic speeches the next. Finally, when the Senate's condemnation became inescapable, he chose death over capture. With the help of a freedman, he pressed a blade to his throat, crying, "What an artist dies in me." His body fell, and with it, the empire of illusions he had constructed. But for Sporus, Nero's death did not bring freedom. If anything, it marked the beginning of a new torment. As one of the most visible symbols of Nero's bizarre reign, he was too valuable and too dangerous to be ignored. Successive men in power claimed him as though he were property. Nymphidius Sabinus, a Praetorian prefect, took him first, treating him as Nero had, dressing him as Poppaea, parading him as though the empress still lived. When Nymphidius was killed, Otho seized Sporus, continuing the grotesque charade. Later Vitellius, yet another claimant to the throne, took possession of him. In each case, Sporus was not a person, but a token, a relic of Nero's decadence to be displayed or wielded. The cycle of humiliation continued, and with every change of master, the boy's identity receded further into shadow. The irony was bitter in surviving Nero. He did not escape the role Nero had forced upon him. He was still Sabina, never again Sporus. Vitellius brought Sporus to the brink of his final degradation. The new emperor planned a cruel spectacle for the arena, a reenactment of mythological scenes in which Sporus would be publicly assaulted and humiliated before thousands of jeering spectators. The emperor who once claimed him as a wife would now be echoed by an emperor who sought to turn him into a living parody for Rome's amusement. It was the last act of a long nightmare. Faced with his fate, Sporus made the only choice still available to him. Rather than submit to the humiliation of the arena, he took his own life, likely by poison, sometime in 69 AD, at barely 20 years old. His end was quiet, private and final, a stark contrast to the theater of violence and spectacle that had consumed his short life. In death, he reclaimed what had been denied him in life: agency over his own body, his own fate. The ancient historians who record his story, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, seldom dwell on Sporus as a person. To them, he was a symbol of Nero's excess, a footnote in the annals of imperial decadence. They describe his transformation and his marriage, his humiliations and his suicide, but rarely ask who he was beneath it all. What dreams did he have before Nero noticed him? What life might he have led if not captured in the emperor's madness? And yet across the centuries, his story lingers. It is not remembered for triumph or glory, but for suffering, resilience, and the terrible cost of unchecked power. In choosing death rather than degradation, Sporus left behind a final act of defiance, a spark of humanity unextinguished despite years of erasure. His tragedy forces us to look past the marble statues and gilded palaces of Rome to see the individuals whose lives were consumed by the whims of emperors. Rome was an empire built on spectacle, but behind the spectacles were people. Sporus reminds us that beneath every tale of grandeur lies another tale of those who paid the price. His story is not just about Nero's madness, nor Pompeia's death, nor the collapse of a dynasty. It is about a boy who was stripped of everything, yet in his last moment reclaimed the one thing that mattered: the power to choose his end. 2,000 years later, his name still unsettles, still whispers from the margins of history. Sporus, the boy who was made into an empress, who lived as a ghost, and who died as himself